It was the kind of cold, cloudy morning that felt as though it could either rain or snow. The town of Meadowbrook, nestled quietly between a mountain range and a river, had always been an uneventful place. People went about their lives here without much concern for the world beyond, content with their small routines and peaceful existence. But today, something was different. Something felt heavy, lingering in the air, as if an invisible storm was about to break. Elena stood outside the police station, staring at the entrance as if it were a door to another dimension. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest, her fingers trembling as they clutched her phone. She was going to tell them everything, confess the unthinkable, and hope. No, pray that it wasn't too late. The sound of sirens in the distance echoed through the small town, snapping her out of her trance. Elena took a deep breath and wiped a tear that had escaped her left eye. The clock was ticking, and she had to make things right. But how did she get here? How did her life turn into such a nightmare? 3 months ago, things were different. It was an ordinary day, like any other. The sun had risen just above the hills, casting a warm glow over Meadowbrook's quiet streets. Elena hurried through her morning routine, preparing breakfast for her 14-year-old daughter, Sophia. They lived in a modest 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, where the roads turned from pavement to dirt, and the sounds of nature were more common than the sounds of traffic. Elena was a single mother who worked 2 jobs, one as a cashier at a local grocery store and another cleaning offices at night. Life was hard, but manageable. Her days were filled with exhaustion, but also love. Sophia was her world, a bright, kind girl who never complained, even when things got tough. The bond between mother and daughter was unbreakable, forged by years of shared struggle. "Sophia, you're going to be late for school," Elena called out, flipping a pancake onto a plate. I'm coming," Sophia replied, dragging her backpack through the hallway and into the kitchen. She sat down, looking a little pale, her eyes slightly sunken. Elena noticed immediately. "You okay, honey?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Yeah, just tired," Sophia replied, offering a weak smile. "School's been a lot lately." Elena frowned but didn't push. Sophia was always such a good student, balancing homework, social life, and their home responsibilities with grace. She never wanted to burden Elena with her own problems. Elena chalked it up to stress from school. But something felt off, and deep down, she knew it. 2 weeks later, their lives changed forever. Sophia's fatigue worsened. She started complaining of headaches, her energy drained from her body with each passing day. Elena took her to the local clinic, expecting the doctor to tell her it was just anemia or maybe some sort of viral infection. But the news was far worse than anything she could have imagined. "I'm so sorry, Ms. Ruiz," the doctor had said, his voice heavy with sympathy. "Your daughter has leukemia." Elena's world spun. It was as though the floor had collapsed beneath her feet. Everything became a blur. The doctor's voice faded into the background as her mind struggled to process the words. Cancer. Her baby girl had cancer. Sophia's treatment began almost immediately. Chemotherapy, blood transfusions, hospital stays. Each day became a battle against time and illness. The medical bills, once manageable, soon spiraled out of control. Elena was drowning in debt, her savings depleted within weeks. Insurance only covered so much, and the cost of medications, tests, and specialized care quickly exceeded what she could afford. The people of Meadowbrook, always a close-knit community, initially rallied around them. Fundraisers were held, neighbors brought over meals, and Sophia's classmates sent cards and well wishes. But as the months dragged on, the financial strain became unbearable. The kindness of others, though appreciated, couldn't pay the mounting hospital bills. Elena tried to keep up with her jobs, but she was falling behind. Her boss at the grocery store became impatient with her frequent absences, and the office cleaning company had to hire someone else to fill in for her night shifts. She was barely hanging on by a thread, both emotionally and financially. It was during one of her lowest points that Darren appeared. He was a stranger in town, a man with an easy smile and a smooth voice. He introduced himself as a businessman, someone who had come to Meadowbrook looking for investment opportunities. Darren was charismatic, always quick to lend a listening ear when Alina needed to vent about the overwhelming pressures in her life. At first, he seemed like a friend, someone who genuinely cared. He offered to help her with small things, groceries, a little cash to tide her over when things got too tight. Alina, prideful and independent, refused at first, but Darren had a way of breaking down her defenses. He never pushed too hard, always backing off when he sensed her discomfort, but leaving just enough temptation behind. "Why don't you take a break, Alina?" Darren suggested one afternoon as they sat at a local cafe. "You've been working yourself into the ground. Let me help you." Alina smiled weakly but shook her head. "I can't afford to stop. Sophia needs me. And even if I wanted to, there's no way to take a break. Not from this." Darren's expression changed slightly, a shadow passing over his features. He leaned in closer, his voice lowering. "You know, there are other ways to make money. Fast money. You wouldn't have to work so hard." Alina froze. There was something in his tone that made her uneasy, but before she could respond, Darren quickly changed the subject, easing the tension. Days turned into weeks, and Darren continued to insert himself into Alina's life. He was always around, always offering solutions to her problems. At first, it seemed harmless. He suggested she take out a loan from someone he knew, a private lender who wouldn't ask too many questions. Alina was desperate, so she took his advice. But soon enough, the loan became another burden she couldn't bear. The interest rates were astronomical, and Darren's friend wasn't as understanding as she'd been led to believe. Alina was trapped. Every option she turned to seemed to close in on her, like walls pushing in from all sides. And that's when Darren made his ultimate proposal. "It doesn't have to be this hard, you know," he said one evening, his voice calm but firm. "There are people out there who would pay a lot of money to take care of Sophia. People with resources, doctors, connections. They could give her the care you can't afford. You'd be free from this, and she'd be in good hands." Alina's stomach churned. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I mean," Darren said slowly, "there are people who would pay a lot of money to take Sophia. She wouldn't have to suffer anymore, and you wouldn't have to break yourself trying to save her." The room felt like it was spinning. Alina stared at him in disbelief. Was he actually suggesting what she thought he was? Was he really telling her to sell her daughter? That night, Alina didn't sleep. Her mind raced, replaying Darren's words over and over again. How could he suggest such a thing? And yet, a tiny, awful part of her brain couldn't stop considering it. Was it really the worst idea? If these people had the resources, if they could take Sophia and provide the care she needed, would that be so wrong? The thought disgusted her, but it lingered. Every time she looked at Sophia's frail body, her bald head from the chemotherapy, her tired eyes, Alina's heart broke a little more. She was failing her daughter. She was supposed to protect her, but no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. The weight of her decision hung over her like a storm cloud. Desperation gnawed at her soul, pulling her toward a decision that no mother should ever have to make. The next time Darren called, Alina hesitated but answered. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. And that hesitation was all Darren needed to push her further down the path of no return. Alina's world, already fragile, was collapsing under the weight of desperation. It had been 2 weeks since Darren first made his terrifying proposition, and Alina was no closer to finding a way out of her financial and emotional nightmare. The mountain of medical bills only grew higher. Her 2 jobs were no longer enough to keep her family afloat, and the money she had borrowed from Darren's so-called friend was eating her alive. Interest accumulated at a punishing rate, and the lender had become more aggressive in his demands. Alina received phone calls at all hours of the day, threatening her with legal action, eviction, and worse. The future she once imagined for Sophia, graduating high school, going to college, living a long, healthy life, now seemed like an impossible dream, slipping further from her grasp with every passing moment. Elena stood in the kitchen, staring at the stack of unpaid bills piled high on the counter. She couldn't even bring herself to open the latest ones. Her hands trembled as she reached for one of the envelopes, her vision blurring with tears. It felt like she was suffocating, drowning in a sea of obligations she couldn't meet. "Mom." Sophia's voice echoed down the hallway, fragile and soft. She had been so quiet lately, her once bubbly, energetic personality dimmed by the sickness that had taken over her body. Elena quickly wiped her eyes and forced a smile, but she could feel the strain in her face as she tried to act normal. "Hey, sweetheart," she called back, her voice cracking slightly. "How are you feeling?" "Okay," Sophia replied, though the pale, almost ghostly look on her face said otherwise. "I'm just really tired. I think I'll lie down for a bit." Elena nodded, unable to find the words to comfort her daughter. Watching Sophia suffer had become a daily reminder of her failure as a mother. She felt utterly powerless. She had always prided herself on her strength, on being able to handle anything life threw her way. But this was something she could never have prepared for. After Sophia retreated to her bedroom, Elena slumped against the kitchen counter. Her chest felt tight, as though a vice was squeezing her heart, making it impossible to breathe. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, that they would somehow make it through. She needed help, but every possible solution seemed darker and more dangerous than the last. Later that night, after Sophia had fallen asleep, Elena sat in the dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the television. The flickering images on the screen barely registered in her mind as she tried to think of what to do next. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking the silence. She picked it up and saw Darren's name flashing across the screen. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something inside her compelled her to answer. "Hello," Elena said, her voice barely audible. "Elena." Darren's voice was smooth and calm, as it always was. He had a way of making everything sound so easy, so manageable. "How are you holding up?" She hesitated. "Not great," she admitted, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know how much longer I can do this." "You're stronger than you think," Darren replied, his tone soft yet insistent. "But I get it. You're overwhelmed, and that's why I want to help you. You don't have to keep doing this alone." Elena closed her eyes, tears welling up again. She didn't want to need Darren. She didn't want to rely on him, but she was trapped, and he seemed like the only person offering any kind of solution, even if that solution terrified her. "I don't know, Darren," she whispered. "I can't." "I know you're scared," he interrupted gently, "but think about Sophia. This is about giving her the life she deserves. You've done everything you can, but this illness is bigger than you. The people I know can help her in ways you can't even imagine. She'll get the best care, the best treatments. You'll be free from all of this, freed from the stress, the worry, the constant pain." Elena's heart pounded in her chest. Darren made it sound so simple, so logical, but every fiber of her being screamed that this was wrong. How could she even consider giving up her own daughter? How could she even entertain the idea of letting someone else take her away? What exactly would happen to her? Elena asked, her voice shaking. It was a question she had been too afraid to ask until now. Darren hesitated for just a moment before responding. "There's a family, wealthy, connected, powerful. They're looking for a child to care for, someone who needs help. They're not interested in adoption, not legally, at least. It's more of a private arrangement. They pay for Sophia's medical care, provide her with the best doctors, the best of everything. In exchange, they get to raise her." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, suffocating Elena. Raise her? Did that mean she would never see Sophia again? That she would have to give her up forever? And I'd never see her again? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Darren sighed softly, as if he was trying to sound sympathetic. You'd have to let her go, Elena. It's the only way they'll agree to take her. But think about what she'd gain. A life without illness, without suffering. Isn't that what you want for her? Elena's mind raced. It felt like the walls were closing in on her, the room spinning as the weight of Darren's words crushed her. She couldn't think straight, couldn't see a way out. Her love for Sophia was limitless, but her resources were not. If she continued down this path, she might lose Sophia to the disease anyway. Would it be better to lose her now, knowing she would at least be alive and cared for? For days, Elena wrestled with the decision. Every time she looked at Sophia's gaunt face, her frail body, and the dark circles under her eyes, she felt an overwhelming sense of failure. She had tried so hard to be strong for her daughter, but nothing she did was enough. Sophia was slipping away from her, one painful breath at a time. The following evening, after putting Sophia to bed, Elena called Darren. Her hand shook as she held the phone to her ear, her heart pounding so loudly she thought he might be able to hear it on the other end. Darren, she said quietly when he answered. I need to talk to you. Of course, Darren replied smoothly. Let's meet tomorrow. I'll explain everything. The next day, Elena met Darren in a secluded park just outside of town. The autumn leaves crunched underfoot as she approached him, her heart heavy with guilt and fear. Darren smiled warmly, as though they were simply two old friends meeting for coffee. Elena, he said, his voice soothing. I knew you'd come around. I haven't agreed to anything yet. Elena snapped, her voice shaking. I need to understand. I need to know exactly what you're asking me to do. Darren nodded, his expression calm. I understand. This is a big decision, and I want to make sure you're comfortable with it. They sat down on a bench, and Darren laid out the details of the arrangement. He spoke in careful, measured tones, as though he were negotiating a business deal rather than a human life. The family he represented was wealthy, powerful, and discreet. Sophia would be taken to a private facility where she would receive top-notch medical care, away from prying eyes and public scrutiny. In exchange, Elena would receive a large sum of money, enough to pay off her debts and start a new life. The catch: she would never see Sophia again. Elena sat in the dim light of her living room, staring at the blank television screen. The air around her felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of her impending choice. Darren's words echoed in her mind, over and over again. He had painted a picture of salvation, a way out, a way for Sophia to survive, and for Elena to escape the crushing weight of her debts and despair. But the cost. The cost was unimaginable. Could she really sell her daughter? For days, Elena battled herself. The guilt gnawed at her like a ravenous animal, and each time she looked at Sophia, it was like a knife twisting deeper into her chest. Her daughter was so frail now, the illness stripping away the vibrant young girl she once was. Sophia had always been the light in Elena's life, the one thing that kept her grounded in a world that often seemed cold and unforgiving. Now, Elena was faced with the possibility of losing her, not just to the disease, but to something far darker. That night, as Sophia slept, Elena sat by her bedside, gently stroking her daughter's hair. The faint beep of the IV pump filled the room with an almost rhythmic pattern, a cruel reminder of Sophia's dependence on life-sustaining treatments. Her skin, once warm and full of color, had turned pale and waxy. Her lips were chapped, her eyelids heavy even in sleep. How did we get here? Elena whispered, tears filling her eyes as she looked down at her daughter. How did everything go so wrong? Sophia stirred slightly but didn't wake. She was too exhausted to even open her eyes most days. Elena reached out and gently took Sophia's hand, feeling the weight of her small fingers against her own. A surge of love filled her, but it was immediately followed by a wave of hopelessness. No matter how much she loved her daughter, no amount of love would pay for the treatments. No amount of love would make the cancer go away. Elena's mind kept circling back to Darren's offer. He had told her that Sophia would get the best medical care, that she would be treated by doctors with resources far beyond anything the local hospital could offer. It was a sick, twisted proposition, but the logical part of Elena's mind couldn't help but ask, wouldn't it be better for Sophia to live with strangers and be healthy than to die with her mother by her side? The thought sickened her, but it wouldn't go away. 2 more weeks passed. In that time, Sophia's condition worsened. The doctors at the hospital were running out of options. The experimental treatments they had suggested were far beyond what Elena could afford, and the insurance company had already denied coverage multiple times. Elena found herself staring at the latest hospital bill, her hands trembling as she held the paper. The numbers seemed unreal, as if they belonged to someone else's life, someone else's nightmare. She called the hospital billing office, her voice shaking as she tried to negotiate more time. But the woman on the other end of the line was emotionless, robotic. "I'm sorry, Ms. Ruiz, but if we don't receive payment by the end of the month, we'll have to discontinue your daughter's treatment. There's nothing more we can do." Those words, "there's nothing more we can do," haunted Elena. That night, she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her heart racing with anxiety. How could she go on like this? How could she watch her daughter waste away, knowing there was a possibility, however slim, that Sophia could survive if Elena took Darren's offer? Could she live with herself if Sophia died and she had done nothing? The next morning, Elena stood in front of the mirror, looking at her reflection. She hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. Her eyes were sunken, dark circles etched beneath them from weeks of sleepless nights. Her hair was limp, unwashed, and her skin was pale, almost as colorless as Sophia's. She felt like she was disappearing, fading away under the weight of her own grief and guilt. Something inside her snapped. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't keep fighting a battle she knew she was going to lose. If there was even a chance that Darren's offer could save Sophia's life, she had to take it, no matter what the cost. With trembling hands, Elena picked up her phone and dialed Darren's number. She hadn't spoken to him since their last meeting in the next day. Elena sat across from Darren in the back booth of the diner. The smell of stale coffee filled the air, and the low hum of conversation buzzed around them. But it felt like they were in a bubble, detached from the world. Darren, dressed in his usual impeccable suit, looked calm and collected, while Elena felt like her heart was about to burst from her chest. "Are you ready to talk?" Darren asked, leaning forward slightly. His eyes gleamed with something that made Elena uneasy, like a predator waiting to pounce. "I've thought about what you said," Elena began, her voice shaking. "About Sophia. And I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can just give her away." Darren nodded, as though he had expected this hesitation. "I know this is hard, Elena, but you have to think about what's best for her. You're out of options. The hospital is going to stop her treatment, and without it, she doesn't stand a chance. The people I know can save her. They can give her the life you want for her, the life she deserves." Elena felt her chest tighten. "But I'll never see her again." Darren leaned back in his seat, folding his hands together. "That's the trade-off. You give her up, and in return, she gets to live. You'll get a payout, of course. Enough to start over, clear your debts, and build a new life. But you have to let her go." Elena's eyes filled with tears. How could any mother make this decision? How could she weigh the value of her daughter's life against her own need to hold on to her? Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to protect Sophia, but another part of her, the part that had been worn down by exhaustion and hopelessness, told her that Darren was right. Sophia needed more than Elena could give, and if she stayed with her, she would die. What do I need to do?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible. Darren smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "It's simple. You sign the papers, and I'll take care of the rest. Sophia will be transferred to a private facility where she'll get the best care. You'll be given a new identity, along with enough money to start fresh. No one will know what happened." Elena felt sick to her stomach, but she nodded. Okay. Park, and part of her had hoped she would never have to. But here she was, about to make the most unthinkable decision of her life. The phone rang twice before Darren answered. "Elena," he said smoothly, as if he had been expecting her call. "I was starting to wonder if I'd ever hear from you again." Elena swallowed hard, her throat dry. I need to talk to you about the offer." There was a brief silence on the other end, and then Darren's voice softened. "I understand. Why don't we meet somewhere private? We can discuss everything." Elena nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay. Tomorrow. At the diner on 5th Street. Noon." "I'll be there," Darren said, his voice carrying an air of certainty that sent chills down Elena's spine. The next morning, Elena sat in her car outside the hospital, clutching a pen in her hand. In front of her, on the dashboard, were the papers Darren had given her. The legal documents that would sever her ties to Sophia forever. All she had to do was sign them, and Sophia would be taken to the private facility Darren had promised. The hospital would no longer be a threat. The debts would be wiped away. But so would her daughter. Elena had always believed that karma was just a concept, something people use to make sense of the world's injustices, a way to cope when bad things happen to good people. But after that fateful day, when she signed away her daughter's life, karma felt like a living, breathing force, one that had come to collect on the choices she had made. The weight of her decision hung over her like a dark cloud, and although she had convinced herself it was the only way to save Sophia, the guilt was suffocating. 2 weeks had passed since she had handed Sophia over to Darren's people. In the beginning, she tried to comfort herself with the thought that Sophia was in good hands, being cared for by people who could give her the treatment she needed. Darren had promised Elena updates, reassurances that Sophia was thriving in her new life. But no updates came. No phone calls. No messages. Just silence. At first, Elena told herself that no news was good news. But as the days dragged on, her mind began to wander into darker places. What if something had gone wrong? What if Darren had lied to her? The fear gnawed at her day and night, until she could no longer stand the uncertainty. Her hand shook as she brought the pen to the paper, every fiber of her being screamed at her to stop, to run into the hospital and take Sophia far, far away. But where could they go? How could they escape the crushing reality that had consumed them? Tears blurred her vision as she scrawled her name across the bottom of the page. With each stroke of the pen, it felt like a piece of her soul was being torn away. When she finished, she sat back in the driver's seat, numb, hollow. It was done. She had just sold her daughter. Elena sat there, staring at the papers, unable to comprehend the enormity of what she had just done. The sun was setting behind the hospital, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and in that moment, she realized there was no turning back. But what Elena didn't know was that her decision had set in motion a chain of events far more dangerous and far more tragic than she could have ever imagined, and it would all come crashing down sooner than she thought. Elena sat at her kitchen table, staring down at the remnants of the following day. Elena drove to Darren's office, a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of town. She had been there only once before, when they had finalized the details of the arrangement. The blinds were drawn, and the parking lot was empty, but Elena's determination pushed her forward. She marched up to the front door and knocked loudly, hoping someone would answer. After a long moment of silence, the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with graying hair and a weary expression. He looked confused as he stared at Elena, clearly not expecting anyone. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "I'm looking for Darren," Elena said, her voice steady despite the anxiety that churned in her stomach. "He works here, right?" The man frowned, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, but you must be mistaken. No one named Darren works here. Alina's heart skipped a beat. But I was just here a few weeks ago. Darren runs this place. Are you sure? The man sighed, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. Look, lady, I don't know what you're talking about, but this office has been empty for months. We've been trying to sell the building, but no one's been interested. There's no Darren, and there's no office here. Alina felt the blood drain from her face. But I signed papers here. He promised. The man shrugged, clearly not interested in hearing more. If you've been duped, I suggest you take it up with the police. And with that, he turned and walked back into the building, leaving Alina standing in the cold, rain-soaked parking lot, her mind reeling. Untouched meal. The once cozy house felt cold and empty without Sophia's presence. Every corner seemed haunted by her absence. The drawings Sophia had made still hung on the fridge. Her bedroom door was slightly ajar, revealing a bed that hadn't been slept in for weeks. It was as though Sophia had simply vanished, leaving behind a life that felt hollow and incomplete. That evening, as the wind howled outside and the rain beat against the windows, Alina's phone buzzed on the table, startling her out of her thoughts. She quickly grabbed it, hoping for a message from Darren, but her heart sank when she saw it was just a reminder from the hospital about the unpaid bills that were now irrelevant. Alina pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. She had done this to save Sophia, but why didn't it feel like a victory? Why did it feel like a betrayal? Unable to take the silence anymore, Alina decided to take matters into her own hands. She needed to know what had happened to Sophia, where she was, how she was doing. She couldn't live like this, consumed by guilt and fear. It was as if the ground had been pulled out from beneath her. Darren wasn't who he said he was. The office didn't exist. And Sophia, where was she? A deep primal fear gripped Alina as she realized she had been conned. Darren had never intended to help Sophia. He had used Alina's desperation, manipulated her into giving up her own daughter. Alina's legs felt weak, and she collapsed against her car, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. What had she done? What had she let happen to her daughter? The enormity of her mistake hit her like a freight train, and she couldn't stop the sobs that racked her body. She had trusted Darren. She had believed his promises, and now Sophia was gone, lost to people she didn't know, people who might not even be taking care of her. 1,000 horrifying scenarios raced through Alina's mind, each one worse than the last. She had failed as a mother, and now she might never see Sophia again. That night, Alina went home and sat at her computer, determined to find out everything she could about Darren and the people he worked for. She scoured the internet for hours, digging through old articles, forums, and websites, hoping for any clue that might lead her to Sophia. But there was nothing. No trace of Darren, no information about the private facility he had mentioned, no record of any organization connected to Sophia's care. Frustration and fear gnawed at her, but she refused to give up. If the authorities wouldn't help her, she would find Sophia on her own. She spent the next several days contacting private investigators, scouring the dark corners of the internet for anyone who might have information. Every lead felt like a dead end, every hope dashed by more silence. Her life became a blur of sleepless nights and frantic research. She hardly ate, hardly slept. Every phone call, every email felt like a lifeline, but none of them brought her any closer to finding Sophia. That night, Alina went home and sat at her computer, determined to find out everything she could about Darren and the people he worked for. She scoured the internet for hours, digging through old articles, forums, and websites, hoping for any clue that might lead her to Sophia. But there was nothing. No trace of Darren, no information about the private facility he had mentioned, no record of any organization connected to Sophia's care. Frustration and fear gnawed at her, but she refused to give up. If the authorities wouldn't help her, she would find Sophia on her own. She spent the next several days contacting private investigators, scouring the dark corners of the internet for anyone who might have information. Every lead felt like a dead end, every hope dashed by more silence. Her life became a blur of sleepless nights and frantic research. She hardly ate, hardly slept. Every phone call, every email felt like a lifeline, but none of them brought her any closer to finding Sofia. It wasn't until a week later that Elena got her first real lead. She had been speaking to a private investigator, a grizzled man in his late 50s who had seen his fair share of cases like hers. Desperate parents searching for lost children. He listened to Elena's story with a quiet intensity, occasionally jotting down notes in a worn notebook. There's a lot of shady stuff out there, especially when it comes to people like Darren, the investigator said after she had finished. These types of operations, human trafficking, underground networks, they prey on people in situations like yours. Elena felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Do you think Sofia's been trafficked? The investigator hesitated before responding. It's a possibility. But I've got some contacts in the area, people who might be able to find out more. Elena clung to that sliver of hope, praying that the investigator could help her track down Sofia before it was too late. A few days later, the investigator called Elena with news. He had managed to track down Darren, or at least the man who called himself Darren. His real name was Marcus Bell, and he had a long history of involvement in illegal activities, including human trafficking and fraudulent adoption schemes. He was a known figure in underground circles, a master manipulator who preyed on vulnerable parents and desperate individuals. Elena's heart sank as she listened to the investigator's report. Marcus Bell had been operating in various cities under different aliases, but he had always managed to slip through the cracks, evading law enforcement at every turn. But now, with this new information, the investigator was confident they could find Sofia, if they moved quickly. With the help of the investigator and local law enforcement, Elena set a plan in motion to confront Marcus Bell. They tracked him to a rundown house on the outskirts of a neighboring city, where he had been hiding out for the past few weeks. The house was isolated, surrounded by trees and overgrown weeds, the perfect place for someone like Marcus to operate in secret. Elena's heart pounded in her chest as she watched from a distance, her hands clenched into fists. The police moved in swiftly, surrounding the house and breaking down the door. Shouts echoed through the night as officers swarmed the building, guns drawn. Elena watched, her breath held, praying that Sofia was inside. Minutes later, the door swung open, and 2 officers emerged, leading Marcus Bell in handcuffs. His face was twisted into a sneer, but there was no sign of remorse in his eyes. Elena's stomach churned at the sight of him, the man who had taken everything from her. But then, a miracle happened. Behind the officers, a small figure emerged from the house. Sofia. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she saw her daughter, alive but shaken. Tears streamed down her face as she ran toward Sofia, pulling her into her arms and holding her tightly. Sofia was thin, her face pale and tired, but she was alive. She was safe. Marcus Bell had taken everything from Elena, but in the end, karma had come for him. He was charged with multiple crimes, including child trafficking and fraud, and would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for Elena, the relief that washed over Elena as she clutched Sofia in her arms was overwhelming, a wave of emotion so powerful that it nearly knocked her off her feet. For weeks, she had been living in a nightmare, consumed by guilt, fear, and regret. Now Sofia was back. She was alive. But as Elena stood there in the pouring rain, holding her daughter close, she knew this was far from the end of their journey. Sofia had been through something terrible, something neither of them fully understood yet, and while Marcus Bell was finally in custody, facing charges that would ensure he never hurt anyone again, the damage he had done was far-reaching. For Elena, the road to redemption had only just begun. Elena nodded slowly, her hands shaking as she reached for the papers in front of her. Signing them felt like another weight being placed on her shoulders, another reminder of the choices she had made and the consequences that would follow. But she had to do this, for Sophia, for herself, and for all the other victims Marcus Bell had manipulated. The police station was cold and sterile, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over everything. Elena sat across from Detective Jenny Morales, the lead investigator who had been instrumental in finding Sophia and bringing Marcus Bell to justice. Sophia sat next to her mother, silent and withdrawn, staring down at her hands as if trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Detective Morales slid a stack of papers across the table toward Elena. "We're going to need you to go through these and sign them," she said gently. "They're just formal statements for the case. But before we move forward, I need you to understand something." Elena looked up, her eyes bloodshot from crying. "What is it?" Morales leaned forward, her expression serious but compassionate. "You've been through a lot, and I can't even begin to imagine the weight of the decisions you've had to make. But legally speaking, we need to discuss your involvement in what happened. You made contact with Marcus Bell. You handed Sophia over to him. And while I believe you were manipulated and coerced, we need to establish the full scope of your actions." Elena's heart sank. She had known this was coming, but hearing the words out loud was like a punch to the gut. "You think I'll be charged, don't you?" she whispered, barely able to get the words out. Morales shook her head. "That's not up to me. Right now, our focus is on building the case against Bell and dismantling his entire network. You're a victim in all of this, but there are still questions that need to be answered. For now, let's take it one step at a time." In the days that followed, Elena tried to return to some sense of normalcy, but the shadow of what had happened loomed over every moment. Sophia had barely spoken since she was rescued. She spent most of her time in her room, curled up on her bed, staring at the ceiling. Elena knew that Sophia had been through something traumatic, but her daughter's silence frightened her more than anything. One evening, Elena knocked softly on Sophia's door before pushing it open. The room was dimly lit, and Sophia was lying under the covers, her eyes open but distant. "Hey, sweetheart," Elena said gently, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "Can we talk for a bit?" Sophia didn't respond at first, her gaze still fixed on the ceiling. Elena's heart ached as she watched her daughter, her once lively, bubbly girl now a shell of her former self. She didn't know how to reach her, how to help her heal. "Sophia," Elena whispered, reaching out to gently stroke her daughter's hair. "I'm so sorry for everything that happened. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was saving you, but I was wrong. I should have protected you. I should have fought harder." Tears welled up in Elena's eyes, but she blinked them away, determined to be strong for Sophia. She couldn't break down now, not when Sophia needed her the most. After what felt like an eternity, Sophia finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "Why did you let him take me?" The question pierced Elena's heart like a dagger. She had known it was coming, but hearing it from Sophia's lips was unbearable. Elena took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling voice. "I was scared," Elena admitted, her voice cracking with emotion. I thought I was out of options. The medical bills, the doctors, the treatments, they told me they couldn't help you anymore. And Darren, Marcus, he made it sound like you'd be safe, that you get better care than I could ever give you." Sophia's eyes finally met her mother's, and in them, Elena saw the pain and betrayal that had been festering for weeks. "You gave me away," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling with hurt. "You didn't even try to fight for me." Elena's tears finally spilled over, running down her cheeks. "I know, Sophia. I know, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I'm here now. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making it up to you. I'm going to fight for you, every single day. Please, just don't shut me out. I need you too." For a long moment, there was only silence between them, the weight of Sophia's question hanging in the air. But then, slowly, Sophia reached out and took her mother's hand. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to give Elena hope. Maybe they could heal together. As the weeks passed, Alina and Sophia began to rebuild their relationship, slowly and carefully, like piecing together a shattered vase. There were good days. Days when Sophia would smile, laugh, and show glimpses of the girl she used to be. But there were also bad days. Days when she would withdraw, retreat into herself, and refuse to speak to anyone. Alina knew that healing would take time, and she was prepared to be patient. She had made a terrible mistake, and now she had to prove to Sophia that she would never abandon her again. Alina also began attending therapy, not just for Sophia's sake, but for her own. The guilt she carried was a heavy burden, and while she had been trying to focus on Sophia's recovery, she knew she couldn't move forward without addressing her own trauma. Her therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Rachel Lewis, helped her process the overwhelming emotions she had been carrying. "You did what you thought was best in the moment," Dr. Lewis said during one session. "But that doesn't mean you're a bad mother. You were manipulated, and your desperation was used against you. What matters now is how you move forward, how you rebuild your life with Sophia." Alina nodded, though the words still felt hollow. How could she ever forgive herself? How could she move forward when the weight of her decision still hung so heavily on her heart? Meanwhile, the investigation into Marcus Bell's criminal network continued. Detective Morales had been keeping Alina updated on the progress, and it soon became clear that Bell's operation was far larger than anyone had initially realized. He had been involved in fraudulent adoption schemes, human trafficking, and a host of other illegal activities, all of which had devastated countless families. The media caught wind of the story, and soon, Alina found herself thrust into the spotlight. Reporters camped outside her house, eager for interviews and soundbites. At first, Alina wanted nothing to do with the media attention. She didn't want to be the face of a story that was born out of her own shame and mistakes. But as the days passed, she realized that speaking out might be a way to help others. Alina agreed to one interview, a sit-down with a local news station. She told her story, not to gain sympathy, but to warn others about the dangers of people like Marcus Bell. She spoke about how vulnerable she had been, how Darren had preyed on her desperation and fear, and how easily she had been manipulated into making the worst decision of her life. "I want people to know that if you're in a situation like mine, you're not alone," Alina said during the interview, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "There are people out there who will try to take advantage of you when you're at your lowest. But there are also people who can help you, people who won't make you give up the things you love most. Don't be afraid to ask for help." The media coverage of Marcus Bell's arrest had a ripple effect. More victims came forward, and law enforcement agencies across the country began dismantling the vast network Bell had built over the years. His trial became a high-profile case, and in the end, Bell was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice had finally been served, but it didn't erase the damage he had caused. For Alina, watching Bell face the consequences of his actions was bittersweet. On one hand, she felt a sense of relief. He could never hurt anyone again. But on the other hand, she knew that no amount of punishment could undo the trauma Sophia had experienced. There were no simple answers, no easy resolutions. The scars would remain. As the trial came to a close and the media frenzy died down, Alina and Sophia began to find a new rhythm in their lives. Months had passed since Marcus Bell was put behind bars, and life for Alina and Sophia slowly began to stabilize. But normal felt like a distant memory, something they both reached for, but never fully grasped. Their house, once filled with the chatter of everyday life, had become a sanctuary of quiet recovery, a place where both mother and daughter could heal at their own pace. But while the surface may have seemed calm, the emotional undercurrents between them were still turbulent. The journey of rebuilding trust and regaining a sense of security was far from over, and the wounds Marcus Bell had inflicted, both physical and emotional, were still raw. Alina had gotten her daughter back, but it had come at a cost neither of them fully understood yet. The events of the past few months had changed them both, and the road to true healing was still unfolding. The first step toward a new beginning came with Sophia's health improving. After extensive treatments made possible by the generosity of local charities and support groups that had heard their story, Sophia's leukemia finally went into remission. The news was a lifeline for both of them, a rare, shining moment of joy in what had been a seemingly endless stretch of darkness. The doctors had warned Alina to be cautiously optimistic. Remission wasn't the same as a cure, but for now, it was enough. It meant more time, more memories to make, and the chance to watch Sophia become the young woman Alina had always dreamed she'd grow into. But while Sophia's physical health improved, her emotional state remained fragile. She rarely spoke about her time in captivity, and Alina had learned not to push. Therapy helped, but it was a slow, painstaking process. Sophia often woke up in the middle of the night, her face drenched in sweat, the terror of her nightmares refusing to let her go. Alina would rush to her side, holding her as she cried, whispering reassurances that she was safe now, that no one would ever hurt her again. Still, in the quiet moments, when Sophia wasn't watching, Alina's heart ached with guilt. No matter how many times Sophia told her she was forgiven, Alina couldn't fully forgive herself. The image of her signing those papers, of handing her daughter over to a man she barely knew, haunted her daily. In her mind, she replayed every decision, every wrong turn, wondering how she could have been so blind. Meanwhile, the town of Meadowbrook had changed as well. The story of Marcus Bell and his elaborate scheme had shaken the small, close-knit community to its core. People who had once trusted each other implicitly were now more guarded, more suspicious. If someone like Marcus Bell could infiltrate their town, what other dangers might be lurking beneath the surface? For months, the town's gossip mill buzzed with the details of Alina's ordeal. Some people pitied her, seeing her as a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Others were less kind, quietly judging her for the choices she had made. Whispers of how could she have done that? Or what kind of mother would give up her child like that? Floated through the air whenever Alina entered a grocery store or walked down the street. But Alina tried not to let it affect her. She had more important things to worry about: Sophia's health, their healing, and their future. Besides, she had learned something important. People always had opinions, but none of them had walked in her shoes. They hadn't felt the desperation, the crushing hopelessness, or the overwhelming fear of losing a child to a disease that showed no mercy. One day, as Alina sat at her kitchen table sipping tea, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone, so she approached the door with some hesitation. When she opened it, she was met by Detective Jenny Morales, the woman who had played such a pivotal role in finding Sophia and bringing Marcus Bell to justice. "Detective Morales," Alina said, surprised but pleased to see her. "Please, come in." Morales nodded and stepped inside, her expression serious but warm. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Alina replied, motioning for her to sit down. "What brings you here? Is there something new with the case?" Morales sat down at the table, her hands folded in front of her. "There is," she said, her tone careful. "But I wanted to talk to you first, to explain what's going on before it hits the news." Alina's heart sank. "What do you mean? Is Marcus?" Morales shook her head quickly. "No, Marcus Bell is still in custody, and he's not going anywhere. His case is airtight, and he'll never see the outside of a prison cell again." She paused, her brow furrowing slightly. "But during the investigation, we uncovered something unexpected." Alina's stomach churned with a mix of anxiety and dread. "What is it?" "We've been tracing the money flow in Bell's operation," Morales explained, "looking at who funded him, who supported his network. And it turns out he wasn't working alone. There's a much bigger organization behind this, one that's been operating for years, quietly profiting off vulnerable families. Marcus was just one piece of a much larger puzzle." Alina's mind raced as she processed the information. "So, you're saying there are more people like him? More people doing what he did to us?" Morales nodded grimly. "Yes, but we're close to bringing them down. It's going to take time, and we'll need to be careful. But I wanted you to know because it's possible this investigation could bring more attention to your case. The media might reach out to you again, and I want you to be prepared." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Just when she thought the nightmare was over, it seemed like new layers were being uncovered. But she wasn't the same person she had been months ago. She was stronger now, more resolute. If speaking out could help stop this larger network, then she was ready to do it. "Thank you for telling me," Elena said after a moment. "I'll be ready, whatever happens." Morales gave her a small, approving smile. "You're stronger than you know, Elena. You've been through hell, but you've come out the other side. Not everyone could say that." As the months rolled on, the investigation into Marcus Bell's larger network continued to unfold, leading to the arrest of multiple high-profile individuals involved in illegal adoptions, trafficking, and fraud. It became a national story, with Elena and Sophia's case at the heart of it. The media attention was intense, but Elena handled it with a quiet strength, refusing to let it overwhelm her. However, in a twist that no one saw coming, it was revealed that one of the key figures funding Marcus Bell's operation was someone from Meadowbrook itself, a local politician who had been using his influence to cover up the illegal activities. When this news broke, the town was thrown into chaos. People who had once felt safe and secure now questioned everything and everyone around them. Elena was stunned by the revelation. This politician had been someone she had seen around town for years, someone she had trusted, just like everyone else. The betrayal ran deep, not just for her, but for the entire community. But justice in the end was swift. The politician was arrested, along with several others connected to the ring. The town of Meadowbrook would never be the same, but at least the people who had caused so much pain were being held accountable. For Elena, the path to redemption was not a straight line. It was a winding road, filled with painful memories, hard lessons, and emotional scars that would never fully heal. But she had learned to forgive herself, even if the journey had been long and difficult. She had done the unthinkable in a moment of desperation, but she had also fought with everything she had to bring Sophia back. And for that, she had earned the right to move forward. Sophia, too, had begun to heal. Therapy helped, as did the support of her mother and the community, which rallied around them in the aftermath of the revelations about Marcus Bell's network. The nightmares still came, but less frequently. And while Sophia would never forget what had happened to her, she had begun to reclaim her life, one step at a time. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their home, watching the sun set over the horizon, Sophia turned to her mother and spoke the words Elena had longed to hear for months. "I'm going to be okay, Mom," Sophia said softly. "I don't know when, but I will be. And I forgive you." Elena felt tears welling up in her eyes, but for the first time, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of hope, of love, of redemption. "I love you, Sophia," Elena whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I always will." And for the first time in what felt like forever, they both believed in the possibility of a future free from the shadows of the past. As Elena and Sophia embark on their new journey, the question remains for viewers. What would you do if faced with an impossible choice? Could you live with the consequences, or would you fight for redemption, no matter the cost?